Morning folks, happy Friday to you. I hope you're all doing well and that you're pushing things along nicely and you're looking forward to a relaxing weekend ahead. So an interesting few days in the Commons this week, with Boris speaking earlier in the week about the plan for the next 6 months, generally speaking in regards to coronavirus, and Rishi Sunak speaking to the Commons yesterday in regards to his plan for the winter, the economic plan to support what Boris had put forward earlier in the week, essentially. And I'd like to look at that in a little bit of detail, very high level, but basically what's the impact going to be on the property market? And I think this comes down actually to two fairly simple things. Although the mechanics of everything that those guys are planning at the moment and making decisions upon is very intricate and complex, obviously, I think it comes down to supply and demand and inflation. And the impact that those two things have on everything else in the broader economy and in society. So let's start by having a look at what actually happened yesterday, or this week generally, between Boris and Rishi Sunak's announcements. Then look at the pros and cons, and look at the impact regarding inflation and supply and demand and property prices. Right, so essentially Rishi Sunak spoke yesterday following up from Boris' announcements that we would have continued restrictions for at least another 6 months. That's going to keep the brakes applied to the economy in certain areas and make it hard for a lot of individuals to earn their typical earnings that they're accustomed to pre-COVID, to keep their businesses going, to keep their families going, to keep everything happening essentially. So Rishi Sunak yesterday scrapped the autumn budget and gave an announcement instead as a sort of economic plan for the winter, for the next 6 months, and announced his jobs support scheme. Now, for quite some time, we had been expecting that the furlough scheme would end on the 31st of October. He'd come under increasing pressure to extend that scheme from some and from others not to, because it was basically just to delay the inevitable. The Bank of England Governor of the Bank of England had forecast unemployment by the end of the year at around 8%, which would result in the loss of approximately 750,000 jobs. Pre-COVID, our unemployment level was very low, under 4%, almost an historic low. So it's definitely a change of circumstances in an extreme way over a short period of time. But essentially, Rishi Sunak is now saying that for the next 6 months, those whose jobs are still tenable, albeit on a reduced number of hours due to reduced demand over the winter, there will now be an incentive where the employer can pay that employee for a reduced number of hours rather than making them redundant, and the government will step in to support a percentage of the remainder of their wages so that they can stay in employment and earning close to their normal salary. Now, as I say, this is high level. Our accountants will be in touch, I'm sure, to fill us in on the finer details of all of this stuff. But essentially, that's what it comes down to. So we've kind of had this situation where we've been in a bubble for quite some time. If you think about the economy like a balloon, coronavirus is a kind of like a rogue bandit trying to pop that balloon and let the air out. And the government has basically stepped in to prevent that from happening by blowing more air into the balloon to keep it inflated. But it's a temporary measure, and a lot of that was quantitative easing, which now stands around 900 billion. And is likely to increase, because in order to sustain and support this job support scheme, more money is going to have to be printed and pumped into the economy, which, has impacts in terms of inflation particularly, which we'll come on to in a minute. So the pros and cons of this announcement from Rishi Sunak then, well, on the pros side, for a lot of people in tenuous work positions who were vulnerable and concerned that they would be made redundant, they can now breathe a sigh of relief, because there's going to be government aid and support to keep everything going. So, obviously that's very good from that from your perspective, if you're in that position, and then if that in turn from a healthcare perspective, people are going to be less stressed, less likely to get ill, less likely to not be able to support their families, who in turn have difficulties. So all in all, the strain on the National Health Service will probably be contained more, which, given that it's going to be under pressure anyway coming into the winter, is obviously, you know, that's a good thing as well. On the cons side of things with this, I mean, I just feel that you know, this is delaying the inevitable. There's obviously a social conscience and a moral duty on government to protect its people, which I think is the line that Rishi Sunak is now taking, because from an economic standpoint, I'm not sure how much sense this makes now to just keep delaying the inevitable and printing more money and you know, creating pent-up inflationary boom, I would imagine, at some point down the road, and a huge debt that has to be repaid, probably by a hike in taxes down the road too. You know, it creates as many problems as it solves, and it's definitely a race against time now to find a vaccine, because I don't think we could really afford for this to go on 6 months, let alone another 6 months. And as we come into the spring, if we have to extend this further, I think we've got really big problems, to be honest. So there's a kind of a quick look at the pros and cons. In terms of supply and demand and inflation, well, let's have a quick look at the inflation side of things first. Yes, as I mentioned, quantitative easing stood at 900 billion, at my latest check anyway. I'm sure that will have to increase a bit now in order to support 6 months of further governmental intervention and support, which basically means if you've got an economy with a certain amount of money in it and you've got savings of £100,000, and the amount of money in that economy suddenly doubles overnight, the value of your 100,000 in effect is halved, right? Which means that it's kind of like you see hyperinflation in countries where a certain item which used to cost £1 then costs £2, right? To allow for the fact of the devaluation of money. Which, in regards to property prices, if you have a property that's worth £100,000 and twice as much money is pumped into the economy, and the value of 100,000 effectively is halved, then does your asset go from being worth 100,000 to 200,000? And it's a very, very crude example, but essentially the more money that gets pumped into the economy by way of quantitative easing, which at this point is considerably more than what was pumped in due to in the financial crisis of 2008, then over time you're going to see inflation in the value of things, including property prices, right? So if you own assets, over the course of time they are likely to increase in value as a result of inflation, and the more money that gets pumped in, the more inflation we'll see. So in a way, that's good for those who own or are able to acquire next year and the year beyond, because that inflation won't kick in straight away, there'll be a delay there. But for those who don't own, particularly the youth between, let's say, 18 and 25, or increasingly pushing up towards 30, it was hard enough as it was, and it's now going to become much, much, much harder, because the value of the thing that their first home will be greater. You'll probably find that mum and dad have less savings because they've had to use those savings to support their kids who potentially have lost their jobs and are now struggling to find new ones, because it's a much more competitive market and the economy is shrinking. So it's going to hit those guys very hard. In terms of supply and demand then, property prices wise, well, we've been in this suspenseful boom recently where there's been pent-up demand, where the housing market was locked down and viewings couldn't happen and transactions couldn't take place. I suppose demand is up, people are looking to move. Now I wonder on some level whether people have managed to get their hands on these bounce back loans and furlough payments and grants and all sorts, and perhaps have seen an opportunity to use that, even though they shouldn't have done, to be boosting up their asset column and investing and buying new homes and so on. Maybe that accounts for some of the increase in demand too. Supply-wise, perhaps people have been thinking, you know, maybe now's a good time to sell. We've had a lot of tax restrictions placed on landlords over recent years that would have given people who owned property in their own name a strong incentive to sell, plus also perhaps older landlords who are looking at retiring were selling off portfolios at this point, so that could explain some of the supply. But also people who are making provision for a long cold winter with COVID sticking around for a while might want a bit more cash in their bank account to ride through the storm, and now was the right time to sell an asset for that reason. You know, so that could all explain to a certain extent why we've had a boom recently. But you know, that's going to shift at some point, and perhaps this 6-month job support scheme announcement will effectively mean that air comes out of the bubble at a slower rate now. You know, it's not going to burst per se when the furlough scheme ends and we all fall off a cliff. It's going to be a more gradual process into the end of March next year, when the job support scheme will end and also the stamp duty holiday will end, unless they get extended. But if they get extended, then we're going to have to pump more money into the economy, and then the inflationary thing kicks in. So it's kind of like a checks and balances thing. But property prices will start to fall, because as people fall into redundancy or reduced working hours, they have less disposable income, which means that they have less cash to spend, which means that they spend less cash. They're less likely to want to buy property, which means that demand falls. Potentially they're more likely to want to sell property because they need to subsidise their bank balance to ride through the storm, and selling an asset is one way of doing that. So there's more people looking to sell their property, less people looking to buy a property. Supply and demand shifts, with supply outweighing demand, and the value of real estate then falls. Now that was probably due to happen from the 1st of November, and I think it still will to a certain extent, but slower than it might have done as a result of the announcements by Rishi Sunak yesterday. But when it does happen, perhaps sometime gradually into next year, those who can buy through 2021 and 2022, perhaps the early part of 2023 too, but don't leave it too long, if you can buy in a suppressed market where the value of real estate has fallen on account of the supply and demand implications that I just mentioned, hold those properties for the long term until such time as the inflationary impact of all of this quantitative easing starts to shine through. The value of those assets that you've acquired at a lower price than normal will increase in value and ride that inflationary wave. So, to summarise, I think this is just delaying the inevitable. I think it's going to result in an increased amount of money being pumped into the economy through quantitative easing, which has a long-term effect in terms of an inflationary rise, at quite a dramatic inflationary rise potentially in a few years' time. House prices will fall as a result of the supply and demand economics, but not as sharply as we were expecting, because this is just pumping a bit more air into the balloon and taking the sting out of things. But it will start to gradually happen from November onwards. So get your cash ready, get looking for opportunities on the market, keep your eyes and ears open, follow the news. Not too much, because you don't want the negativity in your life, but for the key announcements, keep an eye on those because it impacts what you're doing. And very, very best of luck to you. I mean, look, I wonder what you think. I know it's a slightly longer video today, but it's been an important week in Parliament this week, with big socio-economic implications for the next 6 months and beyond. So it's worthy of discussion and analysis, I think. I look forward to hearing and reading and watching the analysis done by other experts in other fields, such as accountants. You know, how are you guys seeing this? Other property owners, other business owners, other people studying and looking to make their first purchase. I'd love to hear from all of you. I think that there's so much to be learned right now. We're on shifting sands, and it's never been more important to keep your eyes and ears and your mind open to the change that's coming and how we should be adapting to it. So I hope you all have a fantastic Friday, a great weekend ahead, and please do get in touch if you've got any thoughts on this. I'd love to hear from you, as always. Bye for now.